Good morning. It's good to be together. We are continuing on talking about freedom, real freedom. Last week we set up the reality that freedom can only actually be found in Jesus, that we can be externally free, but there's still internal bondage, right? And that the only source of true freedom, real freedom, is the person of Jesus. This week we want to continue exploring some understanding of freedom. And just to kind of get the ball rolling, to be perfectly honest, I find it a bit ironic that I'm actually up here. It's ironic because if you had grown up talking to me at all, or if you've had the pleasure of a lengthy conversation with me, you'll notice something pretty quickly, is the words don't work all the time for me. Like, words and I don't go that well together. Storytelling or words in general just are actually, they're not my forte. It's been a long-running joke that if Dan's telling a story, don't expect it to go anywhere. Because, yeah, it's like an independent film where the plot's just getting good and then the credits roll. That's how my stories go. It's like, wait, that didn't go anywhere. Well, exactly. So people had to, kind of like start helping me out by the end of my stories. And they were like, so at the end you found $5, right? Like, something had to happen. I was like, no, that's the story. There's really no point to it. And then to top all that off, it's like writing also isn't a thing for me. I used to do a little bit of blogging, and how my blogging process would go is I'd write out the article, and then Janine would take it and make it coherent, and then we'd post it online, because I also couldn't write, because a lot of the time pastors actually will write out their message and then they get up and then they teach from like either having memorized it, or they will just, kind of a combination between memorization and reading. But if I did that, you'd all just walk out because you'd be like, this does not make sense at all. So I find it quite ironic actually that I'm up here. And the truth is though, if God tells you to teach, you get up and you teach, trusting that despite your own limitations and weaknesses, God's power will still show up. Limitations, though, are something I certainly do not like. When I think about my lack of ability or my weaknesses, and I think about that word limitation, I actually dread it. And I don't think I'm alone. I think we all dread this general understanding of limitations. One of my favorite books is actually by a guy named Parker Palmer. He's a Quaker missionary, and he's a prolific writer. And it's one of his books that I read almost on an annual basis is called Let Your Life Speak. And in it, he speaks to the reality of our limitations and the understanding of limitations in our day and age in general. And he says this: our problem as Americans, at least among my race and gender, is that we resist the very idea of limits, regarding limits of all sorts as temporary and regrettable impositions on our lives. Sound familiar? Yeah. Our national myth is about the endless defiance of limits. Opening the western frontier, breaking the speed of sound, dropping people on the moon, discovering quote-unquote cyberspace, at the very moment when we have filled old-fashioned space with so much junk that we can barely move, we refuse to take no for an answer. Now, if I had just kind of started this with, we refuse to take no for an answer, we'd be like, yeah, right? We'd be like, yes, that is what we are about. We don't take no for an answer. We're going to smash down walls. We're going to kick in doors. We're going to do all sorts of stuff. But what if there's actually a freedom in knowing our limitations? I don't mean a freedom from limitation. I mean understanding that we have limits and realizing there's actually freedom in our limitations. What if that is true? And what if by not understanding our limitations, we are actually limiting ourselves? Or worse yet, what if by not acknowledging our limitations, we're actually limiting God? What if that's reality? I want to invite you to open up your Bible with me Follow along. We're going to be reading from 2 Corinthians. If you don't have a Bible, it's okay. It will be on the screen. We're going to pick up in verse 6, but before we jump in, it's important to understand we are jumping in the middle. Like a lot of the time, we're jumping in the middle of a story at the end of a letter, and so there's context, there's understanding that we have to have in order to dive in. And the essential context right here is that Paul is writing a letter to the church of Corinth, and at this point in the letter, he's defending his own apostolic, his own sent ministry to the church to start churches on behalf of Jesus. He's defending that kind of authoritative ministry against other people who are all called false apostles, or in just a moment, he actually calls them, he kind of calls them tongue-in-cheek, super apostles. Right? That there are these people who are going around in the church and they're bragging about their own abilities, and maybe the abilities that they're bragging about are widespread. Maybe they have a great amount of influence in culture, or maybe they're really good orators. They have this ability to speak real good, right? Maybe it's a whole host of other situations. Maybe they've built rapport within the church and they're leveraging that on their own behalf. Paul's addressing that, and he's contrasting himself and his own ministry with what they are seeing. See, there's this group of people that are out there bragging, and in their bragging, they're putting down Paul and saying, he has no right over you. You shouldn't listen to Paul. And Paul is refuting that, and he's saying, no, here's the thing I could say, or here are the things I could brag about. And so he goes on, and he starts with his youth, his growing up as a Jewish elitist, as somebody who was brought into the sect of the Pharisees, somebody who is incredibly intelligent, socially influential, somebody who has done everything that the upstanding Jewish male citizen should do to be the cream of the crop. He says, I could brag about those things. Like, that's true. And even before I started following Jesus, I was one of the most radical, right? We read that just a few weeks ago, that Paul was persecuting people who followed Jesus, and now he is one who follows Jesus. And then he goes on beyond just his accomplishments, and he starts talking about his spiritual experiences. And in order to do so, he talks about himself in third person, again, kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of bragging. And he says, I know a person who was caught up into the third heaven. So he starts talking about all these revelations and experiences he's had with the Lord, and he's saying, I could boast about those things, as he just boasted about those things. Right? We have to catch the humor in that. And then he continues on, and this is where we pick up in verse 6. Even if I should choose to boast, which he did, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. So he starts right out of the gate. He starts by saying, listen, I'm not going to boast, but if I did, I'd be telling the truth, meaning they're telling lies. I could be telling the truth if I told you everything that I was doing, because I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain. So no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. This is an incredibly popular passage of text, and I've heard so many people use it in all sorts of ways to fit their own needs at the time. It's one of those passages where it seems to be like, if something's hard and it doesn't go away, let's talk about this. Because then I can release myself of all expectations. But that's actually not what's going on here. If we dive in, we're going to notice just a few things. Again, Paul's addressing kind of these adversarial, false, quote-unquote, super apostles. and differentiates himself from them. He says, no, I could brag about all these things and it would be true, but I refrain so that no one will think of me more than is warranted by what I do or say because of these surpassingly great revelations. So again, Paul alludes to everything that he just bragged about, and he starts in and he says, now I've learned not to boast about these things. I could continue to use all of these things. I could continue to use this as fodder. I could continue to use this as my accreditation for my apostolic ministry. I could do that. But if I did that, then you would think more of me than is actually warranted. And Paul starts to clue us in on something that he's about to really drive home, and that is Paul dealt with pride. It was easy for somebody in his position to deal with, to experience the hardships of pride because he had experienced so much incredible stuff, things that we could only dream of. And in a culture that actually valued things like martyrdom and suffering for the beliefs that you held, like that was a pinnacle of being true to what you believed, Paul could even brag about those things. Those for him were not as much a hardship as they were a point of pride. He could very easily hold that up and say, this, look at me, this is what I've done, this is what I am worth. But he doesn't want people to think more of himself because he already struggles with that. Pride, he's saying, is a pitfall for him. So he continues on, therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, literally an angel of the adversary. Angel of the adversary was given to him. Now, there's all sorts of speculation going on. A quick Google search will reveal that the truth is nobody knows what this thorn is. Some people are like, it's the Judaizers, those who want, who keep following after Paul and want to change his message and say, no, you do have to follow Jewish law in order to follow Jesus. Now, like, all of that is still on the table. That law stuff is not off the table, and there were Judaizers that were coming in behind Paul, and people think, well, maybe it was that. Some people are thinking, well, Paul was blind. Maybe his blindness didn't completely clear up. And so maybe he was still dealing with some kind of like cataracts or something like that. Or maybe because of his beatings, he was suffering from things like epileptic seizures. And the list just goes on and on and on. Do you want to know what it was? We don't know. I don't know. I don't think we need to know. Because actually, that's not Paul's point. The point is not the thorn. I think if we knew what the thorn is, anytime we experience that same thing, we'd be like, it's just what it is. It's just my thorn. I get a pass on this one. It's like, there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, Paul couldn't do anything about it. Just the thorn. That's not Paul's point. We can be specific with what Paul is specific, but we have to be general in what Paul is general about. Here, Paul is general. Now, maybe his audience knew exactly what this thorn was. Maybe they knew in seeing Paul, and it was very evident, but we don't, and that is okay. Because again, the thorn isn't the point. What is the point? Well, number one, let's not gloss over really quickly the fact of who gave him this thorn. The Lord. The Lord allowed an angel of Satan, a messenger from Satan, to afflict Paul. This is like Job kind of stuff, where God just kind of allows all of this to happen, but it's for a point. It's not just general suffering that is happening. This is allowed because of Paul's conceited bents, because of his propensity to be prideful. God allows this to happen. Now, what scholars think is actually happening is that there's pride in Paul's life, and Satan can easily capitalize on that. And so the Lord just kind of removes his hand of protection and allows this messenger of Satan to go in. And it's kind of the same scenario where Satan thought he won when Jesus was crucified on the cross, but what he didn't see coming was the resurrection. It's like the Lord gives Satan sometimes just enough leeway to fail. And actually ends up accomplishing the purposes of God, because the purpose of God was not to afflict Paul, the purpose of God was to humble Paul. It was to keep him from being conceited. And so what Satan thought he would get in there and mess up Paul's life and say, look, I told you, you're prideful, you're no good. Like, you don't get to be an apostle. The Lord's like, well, actually, I got a plan for that. Actually, your word isn't final, Satan. Like, there is a plan for that. I actually do plan on overcoming that. You just, again, you didn't see it coming. Satan doesn't have a lot of tricks in his playbook, but the Lord has millions of tricks in his playbook. And here in this story, again, we find one of those tricks. So the Lord gives this messenger of Satan that Paul refers to as a thorn in the flesh so that Paul will not become conceited, so that he will avoid the pitfalls of pride, so that he won't go on bragging, so that essentially Paul doesn't think that the story is about him. Paul is having so many experiences, he's starting to think that all of this whole movement of Jesus, all of these churches being started and the miracles happening is actually because Paul's just so great. Like, have you ever found yourself there? If you've been through adolescence, you have found yourself there. You're like, I am the world's best gift. We've all been there. Paul was stuck there again. He's starting to think that he is the greatest gift the world has ever known. And sometimes, honestly, in the church, we treat him like that. We treat him as if, well, there's Jesus, but then there's Paul. I think Paul was starting to think about himself that way too, and the Lord said, no, you are a key piece in this, and in order to keep you a key piece in this, you have to remember that you're not the center of the story. Who is the center of the story? Jesus. Jesus is the center of this story. So there's a messenger of Satan, keeps Paul from being conceited. Paul realizes this thing is there, but maybe he doesn't realize the full reality of what's going on. Maybe he doesn't understand the purpose behind that pain. And so he pleads with the Lord 3 times, he says, to take it away from him. Now, there's nothing incredibly special about 3 times, and it's entirely possible that Paul prayed way more than 3 times. 3 was kind of this legal way of saying it's done, like this is true. On the word of 3 witnesses, something was confirmed. So what Paul is really saying is, I definitely prayed for God to take this away from me. I was persistent in it. I just kept asking for this thing to be taken away 3 times. It's done. But the Lord had different plans in this case. The Lord answers him back. In verse 8, he says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now, I like the P's in this. It works really well when you're speaking, but there's so much more there. There's some serious weight to what Jesus just said, and for generations we've been hanging our hat on what Jesus said, so it's important for us to understand exactly what Jesus is getting at. There are some words in here that are incredibly jam-packed full of meaning. One of the biggest words in our faith tradition is grace. It's this word, charis. It's the same word that's used to describe Jesus' gift to us on the cross. This gift of salvation from Jesus is charis. The gifts that the Spirit pours out to us, charis. But it's actually even bigger than that. It's actually a word that had a lot of societal meaning, a lot of cultural meaning as well for Paul's hearers. They would have understood that those with money sometimes would give to those without money. So if there's somebody, if I'm a baker and I'm struggling with my business, I might be able to find a benefactor who will help me. He might be able to dig me out of this hole. That gift of money would be called charis. It was grace. Grace from the benefactor to the one who didn't have it. And quite honestly, there was nothing that the one who didn't have money could do to get the money, so they had to ask for a gift. It's all of this that helps us understand what's going on in Paul's situation, where there is a gift given to Paul from God. One who has to one who does not have. One who has giving to the one who cannot get and cannot earn. And that's actually our understanding of grace. Scholars' favorite definition for grace is unmerited favor. Unmerited is a word we don't really like. Actually, sociologists and political philosophers actually refer to our time and our culture, which actually goes beyond America with the globalization of everything, with globalization of our economy and ideals. Actually, this whole Western world that buys into this perspective is known as the greatest meritocracy that has ever been formed. That if you have, it's because you earned it. And if you don't have, it's because you didn't earn it, you weren't willing to work hard enough, and you're not good enough. You can change that, though. You just have to try harder. There is no grace in our culture. If you have it, it's because you earned it. It's based on merit. Now, for a lot of things, that actually makes a lot of sense. It follows reason, and there are certain places for that. But in the economy of God, that actually doesn't make sense. That's not how he operates. The way God operates is he gives to those who cannot earn. In fact, if we were able to earn grace, it would cease to be grace. It would no longer be, by definition, what it is. It would at that point be merited favor, and that's something altogether. That's just payment. That's like one of those stories I probably used to tell. It's like, guess what happened today? I went to work, and I got paid for what I worked. What'd you get? Paid extra? Just what I deserved. Cool story, bro. That's how they go. You're welcome. That's not grace. Grace is unmerited. It's unearned. It can't be earned by very definition. And it's what God describes the gift that he gives Paul. My grace, my unmerited favor, my charis is sufficient for you. In the midst of this, Paul is expecting something out of God. He prays to God because it's been Paul's experience all along that when he asks God for breakthrough, breakthrough happens. When he asks God for healing, healing happens. When he asks God for deliverance, deliverance happens. When he asks for miracles, miracles happen. It is Paul's regular experience that God moves in power when he asks. That's just the setup God has with his people. It's the gifting of the Holy Spirit. It's God's grace to us. In fact, if God had answered Paul's petition here the way Paul had expected it to be answered, it still would be charis. It would still be a grace. It would still be a gift. So God's talking about a different kind of gift, a gift in the midst of God's no to Paul, saying, no, Paul, because of your conceit, I need to rein you in a little bit. I need you to understand something about who you are. You are a finite being who cannot earn my favor. I am a divine and infinite being that loves to give my unmerited favor. If I let you go on apart from my grace, this is all you. It's like building a tower to the heavens and calling yourself gods like they did in Babel. It's like going back to Babel and saying, let's build a name for ourselves. Let's build a tower to the sky and we'll be like gods. That's the line of thinking that Paul is going down, and God stops it and he says, no, this is my grace to you, that I give you this limitation, this weakness, that I allow this to play out in your life so that my power can be made perfect in your weakness. It's like Jesus is giving an equation here, that Jesus' power, or Jesus' grace, plus Paul's weakness equals the best possible outcome. It takes all of those things to produce what Jesus says as being made perfect. That his grace plus Paul's weakness equals perfected power. Now, this word perfected is interesting because it's not just pure, like maybe we think of perfection or absolutely morally perfect. What he's actually saying is it's this word telos. It brings to its intended outcome. Scripture says that all of life is heading toward an end goal, a telos. We have a telos. We have this goal where everything will at one time be made perfected. It will be brought to completion, brought to its intended outcome. Jesus says when Paul will recognize his weakness, will realize his limitations, allow God's grace to meet him in the middle of it, that brings it to his power to its intended goal, its intended purpose. That if Paul wants to keep not recognizing his limitations, keep ignoring the weaknesses, then Jesus' power can't be brought to its intended goal. It's God's grace, our weakness, which equals the best intended outcome. God's power being manifest. It's what it's supposed to be. In fact, I think here is the main point, is that God's power is visible when we let God's grace meet our weakness. God's power is visible when we let God's grace meet our weakness. Paul couldn't experience the full power of God in his life, even though he had all of these revelations and miracles, until he accepted the depth of his brokenness. So here's the reality, is that we can't experience the depth of God's grace until we realize the depth of our own brokenness. Until we really truly understand our limits, we don't get to experience the depth of God's grace. We will still be trying to build the Tower of Babel to the sky, making a name for ourselves and declaring that we are God's. We will still think that this whole Jesus movement is on our shoulders, that all of the intended outcomes are on our shoulders, when in reality they're on the shoulders of Jesus. He has already won the victory, and he's carrying it out to its telos now. But when we realize our weaknesses, when we recognize our limits, it's through us that God chooses to work. He doesn't divorce his power from us. He doesn't just continue on moving in the world without us. He chooses to work in us and through us. And he's saying, Paul, listen up. I need you to realize your own weakness. I need you to realize your own limitations, so that the intended work I have for you is brought to its goal. It hits its mark. It's made perfect. It's what I intended. This is powerful. And so Paul goes on in response to Jesus, because at that point it's like, what do you say? He gives no more conversation. At that point, Paul is probably just, all right, you got it. That's cool. He says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Paul's getting it. He's like, okay, so if it takes me understanding my limits and my weakness and my brokenness so that God's power may rest on me, then I'm not just going to accept it, I'm going to brag about it. It's going to be the first thing you know about me. Now, I don't think, and we don't have any evidence that Paul went around saying, hi, I'm Paul, here's my thorn. That's not what he's saying. That's not at all what he's saying. Actually, in just a second, we'll find out that's the opposite of what he's saying. What Paul is saying is that understanding our limitations is only an opportunity for God to be God. Until that point, it's us trying to be God. You want to see God's power? Understand the need for his power. You want to experience God's grace? Understand your need for God's grace. Understand God's unmerited favor. It's like when I got to hold my kids for the very first time, there was a sense of overwhelming love that they had not earned, but it was my joy to give them. It is God's joy to give us his unmerited favor and love. It's something worth repeating over and over and over again, that it's God's grace. It's God is the one that is the true lover of our hearts. And it's nothing we can do to earn it, because at that point it ceases to be grace. And it meets us in our limits, it meets us in our weaknesses, all the way to the point where we can actually enjoy. As Paul says, he delights in his weakness. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, which here he defines really easily. If we're wondering what these weaknesses are, he defines it this way: insults, hardships, persecutions, and difficulties. We would love to take that thorn and make it into whatever we are experiencing now, but Paul is pretty clear. He says this is about insults, hardships, persecutions, and difficulties. When you find yourself in that position, get ready. Recognize it, because God's power is getting ready to move, if you will allow it. If you will allow it. So the question then is, how do we allow it? How do we allow the power of God to work through us? What does it mean for us actually to kind of have this attitude of what Paul is saying? How do we really grab on to the reality that God's grace is sufficient for us so that his power can be made perfect in our weakness? How do we do that? Well, we want to follow the pattern of Paul in this scenario. The first one, which it's not going to be on the screen for you this week, so if you're going to write, I'll slow down for you. But the first one is know your weaknesses. Know your weaknesses. Now, here's the truth. I think all of us, when we talk about limitations and weaknesses, we are aware that we are limited. We are aware that we're finite. We're limited. We're aware that there are all sorts of things in our lives which we don't have control over. We get that. But there's a difference between knowing it and accepting it. I think all of our lives and the society around us is shaped in such a way that we rage against those limitations, that we don't take no. But what if the first step is actually acknowledging our weaknesses and knowing it? Any good therapist, the very first thing they're going to do is help lead you back through all sorts of pinnacle moments in your lives, formative moments, usually negative moments, because our nature is to have these moments of weakness or have these moments of failure or have these moments of pain and hurt. And what we do is we know that they're there, but we put them in the past and we refuse to acknowledge them again. We say, no, you will not shape me. But the truth is, you and I have already been shaped by them. We're just denying that we've been shaped by them. So any good therapist, the first thing they're going to do is help go back through and say, yeah, that happened. Yep, you have to accept that. Acceptance in any good 12-step program is one of the first steps. You have to accept that this is the reality of who you are. It's everything that's shaped you. It's everything that's made you. And guess what? Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's the seedbed for the power of God to move. So first, we actually have to accept our weaknesses, because in accepting our weaknesses, we can finally move on to the next step. We can finally receive the depth of God's grace. When we've accepted the depth of our brokenness and our weakness, we can move on and we can accept the depth of God's grace. So the first one is know your weakness. The second one is accept God's grace. And I would say it's this way. As you work back through and you know your weaknesses, as you know all of those pains and hurts and failures and lacking that we find in ourselves, there's a moment there where the enemy wants to get in and he wants to do his work in there, which turns those things into something that we should leave in the past. But God wants to get in there and he wants to sow something else. The enemy wants to get in there and he wants to sow lies about those moments. He wants to start turning those moments and those weaknesses into a judgment on who you and I are. But instead, the Lord wants to look back at that and he says, grace, 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 grace. So how do you accept God's grace? You have to look back and you have to recognize the lie in those moments that the enemy is working on or that you've chosen to accept for yourself, and allow God's unmerited favor to touch those moments. To have that same understanding of when you first maybe held your own child, or you first felt this overwhelming feeling of beauty that nothing else could possibly earn, but you just feel it when you look at the landscape or you look at beauty around you and you realize that just is. That's God's affection and feeling towards you, even in those moments of weakness and failure. That's God's grace. That unmerited, unearned, cannot earn it favor. Let it touch those moments. It's not just enough to accept it. Once you've accepted those moments, you have to allow God's grace to touch them and realize that that is not definitive of who you are, but it is part of who you are. If that was all that you were, that's a bad story, but grace gives us a different story to live into. That's good. All right, so first, know your weakness. Second, accept God's power. And then finally, accept God's grace. And then finally, expect God's power. Expect God's power. I think sometimes we, again, like to look at this thorn in the flesh as an escape for us to accept the lot life has given to us. And we just say, that's just who I am. That's just where I am. That's just what has happened to me. There's nothing I can do about that. That's true apart from God's grace. That's true. With God's grace, there's a different story to live into. There's a different understanding. It's significant that you're not going to find many other stories like this in Scripture where God says, no, 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 you will continue on in this. It's significant that when Paul experiences this, that he goes first to the Lord and he says, would you just take this away? Why does he do that? Because that's his expectation. It's Paul's expectation that when hardship happens, you pray. We said we will be a people who pray first. Paul prayed first. When something bad happened, Paul prayed first. He had an expectation that God's power would show up. The only reason that things are going this way for Paul is he started to believe that the outcomes were actually Paul's results, not God's results. So unless you're dealing with going to the third heaven and dealing with all sorts of pride coming from these surpassing revelations, maybe you don't get to use the thorn in the flesh analogy. It's impossible to build a theology on thorn of flesh outside of God's grace and power. It's impossible. You can't build a theology of suffering without the mercy and grace of Jesus in the midst of it. You can't do it. We are a people who expect God's power. That is the mode of operation for the New Testament people empowered by the Spirit. It's unique here because things didn't go the way they normally go. The way they normally go is God comes in, he heals, he restores, and he makes new in this new creation project. But something different happened. God chose to work differently. He chose to highlight his grace in the midst of what Paul thought was his own story. The expectation is that God enters in. When we talk about bringing the kingdom wherever we go, this is what we are talking about. We aren't talking about something that we produce. We're talking about getting out of the way and understanding that Christ in us produces the rule and reign of Jesus. It's not something I can drum up. It's not something I can work out myself. It's me understanding that I am a finite being, but inviting the infinite being to work. That's the power of God. My weakness plus God's grace equals telos power. Even the great Baptist theologian John Piper accepts this. He says, and in commenting on this, he says, and it is okay to pray for relief. You have permission. It's okay to pray for relief. That's what Paul did until he got word from the Lord. Pain is not a good thing in itself. It's not. God does not delight in your suffering. Satan does, and he must be resisted. Friends, you have not been given a thorn because God delights in your suffering. But sometimes we receive hardships. Sometimes we accept our weaknesses so that God's power can rest on us. Because for whatever reason, he chooses to work through us. His plan of redemption, his plan of restoration is through you. And it's okay to bring everything from your past. It's okay to bring every mistake. It's okay to bring every hurt and hardship and just hear the words grace, grace, grace. And then you can go forward being freed up from a past that you thought you had left behind, from the weaknesses that you thought defined you, and finally experience the power of God. That's okay. It's okay to ask for relief. We have a loving God who delights in giving unmerited favor. And we have a world around us who would love to see people living into that kind of freedom. Limits? That's freeing. That's an opportunity for God's power to work. What if we were a people that lived in that frame of mind? What if we were a people that went into our places of work and went into the places we play and study and live in the neighborhoods that we find ourselves in, and we lived with that kind of freedom, saying limits, past, hurts, failures, grace. Now let's get down to the power of God. Let's see that. What does that look like manifesting in our neighborhoods and in our workplaces and in our relationships and in our families? What does that look like? That doesn't mean from time to time we won't hear no. There are certain things that only get tackled when Jesus returns and everything is finally fixed once and for all time. But friends, there's more of the kingdom available to us in the here and now than we will likely ever take advantage of. How's that? Can we start living into that? We don't have to do it perfectly. But anything worth doing well is worth doing poorly until we can get better at it. Can we start there? Grace. How about that? Let's pray.